Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining us today from the banks of the Hudson River, West Point, is Dr. Lesley Gordon. Lesley, thanks for being with us for the first time here at Emerging Civil War.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
It is a delight to have you with us. Now, Dr. Gordon is a professor of Southern history at the University of Alabama, but she's on a visiting professorship at West Point doing military history. So a little bit of whiplash, north and south, east and west there, but that must be a pretty cool opportunity for you.
Honestly, it's been amazing. I grew up in Connecticut, and I came here as a college student when I was first exploring what became my eventually my first book on George Pickett. So I came here to research him, and then I was back here in '96 on doing the summer seminar, if you know about that, that the Army used to run, and bringing civilians like myself that we were out teaching military history to ROTC cadets throughout the country. And so I got to spend a month here then. And I don't know that I've been back since the '90s. So, and I've been fortunate to spend the entire year here. I live on the garrison, and went through orientation in the summertime. And so been part of really just gotten very used to being part, this being part of my life for the year.
Oh, wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We're going to talk today about your new book, Dread Danger, which looks at cowardice in the Civil War. Fascinating stuff. Before we dive into that, though, I'm always curious how people got interested in the Civil War in the first place. So do you have an origin story that you like to share?
Yeah, I think a few things came together for me as a teenager. Again, in Connecticut, I grew up in a little town called East Granby. It's just outside of Hartford. And I actually was the kind of kid through middle school who had no interest in school. I grew up in a family of readers, and I was the only one who didn't read. We'd go to the library, and I would randomly take a book off the shelf and pretend that I cared about reading, which is, funny to look back on. And so I don't know if it was a combination. I feel like it was happening about the same time. I did originally want to be an artist, and I began sketching. And initially, I just sort of sketched. I had created a family of, it was sort of like based on the Osmonds, right? So I had my own little family of singers, and I drew all of them. And somehow I think it was my dad started steering me toward history, because he was often reading history books, and he thought I might like historical fiction.
Yeah.
So I started reading some Herman Wouk. So, I was reading about World War II. And then I don't know if he recommended or I stumbled on some, John Jakes, the great John Jakes series, the Kent Family Chronicles. And I read those, cover to cover, and I was hooked. And then I started merging that with my drawing. So I would get actual books out of the library that I wanted to look at and read. And I would get the like the Matthew Brady coffee table books, or there was a book that Bill Wiley edited or annotated, and it was all the Civil War photographs, something like They Who Fought Here. And I began drawing Civil War soldiers.
Wow.
Yeah. And I thought I might be some kind of artist. I didn't know that you could be Don Triani. I just thought, well, I love this. I'm going to do it. And I got a job in high school giving tours at the Mark Twain House.
Okay.
So, things were starting to sort of line up. And once I got, sophomore, junior in high school, I announced to my parents that I would only go to college near a Civil War battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not Connecticut. I needed to get out of England. I decided there was no history worth studying, which is hilarious. And long and short of it, they helped steer me to William and Mary, which worked out wonderfully to be in Virginia. And I had an amazing education there in history. And then I had a college professor at William and Mary take me aside and essentially say, ask me, would you like to do what I do? And I did not understand what a professor, what it meant to go to graduate school, or what that meant entirely. But of course, I thought, well, if I get to do history all the time, and I'd pretty much given up on my art career because, as I like to joke, they wouldn't let me just draw Civil War soldiers or so. That was that was a dead end. And and then I started, and so I was like, yes. And I began hanging around all the grad students.
Okay.
I became this tag along to several grad students, including John Koski, who was finishing,
Oh
if
yeah,
you know John, he was
yeah.
finishing, and Steve Newton, they were both finishing their PhDs under Bud Johnson. Budwell Johnson, he was my sort of major professor. And I'd say the other added ingredient to this was I was taking a seminar with Robert Angs, who was a visiting professor at the time. And the assignment for the class was to write a biography of anybody from Virginia. And
Okay.
so I chose Pickett because I had read Killer Angels and I was fascinated by him. And so that launched, that kept me. I wrote my honors thesis about Pickett, and then I ended up at the University of Georgia for my master's and my PhD, and then obviously kept going. So, yeah, looking back, it's been a sort of an interesting route for me. I was didn't have a lot of friends in high school because I was just obsessed with history and obsessed with the Civil War. But it really it was such an incredible outlet for me, and I just remain equally fascinated and energized by the topic. It has never left me. I've never decided, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. So it's been a really long time.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I'm sure you run into people who say like, "Oh, what more is there to write about it?" Well,
Yeah.
what's this? But like, it's really neat to hear that you've never run out of energy from that topic.
No, I don't. I think there's always new things to explore, new interpretations, even revisiting. I know you want to talk about my new book, but my next book, I'm planning to write about the Mobile campaign in Alabama. And I've come to realize there's been very little written about that topic, especially by academic historians. And so, yes, there's quite a bit, I believe, still in our field to explore and even just re-explore.
Wow. In fact, I just happened to be out in Mobile for the American Battlefield Trust doing some stuff for them out there, and what an understudied part of the war. I
Right?
mean, it really goes beyond what we in Virginia consider the bitter end because it goes well into
Yep.
April. I mean, fascinating stuff. So. Wow. So, and I want to go back to something you said a second ago because your advisor took you aside and said, "Hey, you want to do what I
Yeah.
do." So now that you're doing that, what does it mean to you to be a college professor now that you maybe have figured it out a little bit?
Well, I feel very privileged, honestly, to have the opportunity to be a professor, to teach what I love, to write about what I love. I worked hard. I I feel that coming out of the University of Georgia, it was a program that, I think all the graduates there, I went to school with people like Brian Wills and Chris Phillips. Those were some of my classmates at the time. I think all of us had a kind of um, scrappy attitude
Yeah.
that we might not come out of Ivy League, but we were going to work really hard. And I followed, and it's interesting thinking back to William and Mary. So, I learned somewhere along the way to just see what people that were doing what I wanted to do and people that were successful and try to get advice from them and try to follow um, what they were doing. And I think that really served me well. And I have my own graduate students now, and I know it's a very different
Yeah.
job market and it's incredibly discouraging, but I still try to be as supportive as I possibly can. And I believe that if you want to do this and you have the passion for it and you know how difficult it can be and you still want to do it, I feel that I'm going to support you 100%. But I understand again that things have changed, although they were not that easy when I was coming out in the 90s, but it's much worse. I don't want in any way discount that today.
And of course, digital history has, digital technology has changed the field so dramatically compared to back in the day too. And how have you had to adapt to that and help your students adapt to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's been, the benefits of, for example, with so many sources being digitized, newspapers. This book, I was able to I think there were occasionally there was a newspaper that I didn't find, or I'd have to order on microfilm. But my book that came out in 2014, A Broken Regiment, I went to the library and sat with those microfilm reels and methodically read them. And so things like that have made our lives so much easier. And the sources you can find online, it's amazing. But there are challenges, and I think it does have a tendency to discourage visiting actual archives and talking to archivists. And that's still so important. Not everything is online. And some years back, I was at the National Archives and I was trying to track down some sources that I'd seen years prior. I had been helped by Michael Meyer, who used to work there, and he just knew all the nooks and crannies, and he had retired, and nobody could really help me. At one point, somebody said to me, "Well, there's some sources on this, random unit in like Indiana or something." And I said, "No, I'm not just here to look at any unit. I think I was looking at material from the 11th New York." So I think that there's been, like I said, an assumption that you can find everything you want online and that you don't need the expertise of archivists to do so. And that's unfortunate. I think all of us need to be reminded of that, and going to the actual archives or even to historical places yourselves is necessary when you're writing about a topic.
Yeah, the archivist at St. Bonaventure, he and I were just talking the other day, and he's got a little office down in a dark corner of the basement of the library. People are afraid to go and see him, but like archivists know all these golden treasures that are in their
Yes.
collections, and the nuances of those collections in ways that you just can't capture by looking online.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could not agree more.
Now, you talk about giving advice to your students. Since this will air during March, which is Women's History Month, any particular advice or challenges that you see for young women who want to follow in the footsteps that you've gone in?
Well, when I was starting out, it was still a bit of a novelty to be a woman writing about military history. In fact, I often found myself introduced and these were in professional settings, maybe it was a conference, maybe I was meeting a new historian, and they would assume I did women's history, which I'm not trained in women's history. I had one class in grad school that I audited on, and it was the name of it was gender trouble. So I was exposed to some of the theory, gender theory, and broadly the field of women's history. And because a professor took me aside and said, you probably should know a few of these things because you're going to get asked about it on the job market. So there were those kind of assumptions, and I've dealt with some prejudice along the way that I don't really know what I'm talking about, whether it's in the public or even in the classroom. But I think again that scrappiness. I just keep at it and do what I'm going to do. I think it's much better in the field of Civil War history. We have so many excellent younger women that have continued to produce great work, and then I have a circle, frankly, of fellow women historians. We're all about the same age group, some a little bit younger. People like Susanna Ural and Sarah Rubin, Diane Miller Somerville. I could go on. There's a whole bunch of them. They're doing stellar work, and I don't think it's as much of like I said, as much of a kind of an oddity that there's a woman writing about the Civil War. So I think it is easier for women today. But there's still going to be assumptions and some sexism out in the world we live in, and you have to kind of prepare for it and try. I've talked to some of my female graduate students. It can be very difficult, I think, when you're exposed to it in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very painful when you're a new teacher. I know it was hard for me I was trying, when I started out, I felt I looked really young, and I was young. And I thought I had to be very serious in the classroom and stern. And I realized quickly that was a mistake. And I needed to certainly try to be myself and use some sense of humor and be self-deprecating. And that helped, I think somewhat to disarm some of it, but I still I still see it, and I still deal with some of it today, just kind of
Yeah,
silliness from folks. So, what are you gonna do, right? Just got
that's
to do
right. What
your
are you gonna
thing.
do?
And
But yeah, I think it's neat though. You've been able to carve such a neat path for yourself, and you know, write about the sorts of things that you like, and we'll get into this as we talk about your book here in just a second. But like the way you have redefined regimental histories and how we use them and how we think of them. I mean, that's been trailblazing work in the field.
thank you. Yeah, I didn't set out that way. It's funny how these things work out. I just, and overall, I just say that I've written about what I'm interested in, and I
Yeah.
think that that's important, and that is advice I give my own graduate students. You don't want to write about something because you think this is what people want to read, or maybe it's trendy. I think you have to go with your gut and your own intuition about you know what speaks to you. And when I finished my Pickett book, and again, that was my dissertation, I was very anxious, or I wanted to do something northern, and I wanted something connected to my home state. And so that was how I ended up with the 16th Connecticut. I didn't set out to write a regimental history. In fact, I originally thought it would be an article,
Okay.
and then it just grew from there. And then I
That's funny how
decided,
that happens, isn't it?
yeah, and it had to do with sources. It had to do with just discovering so much material on them. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to write about them.
Yeah. So that turned out to be the broker or a broken regiment, the 16th Connecticut, correct?
Yes. Mhm.
And they were what made them broken? I guess is a good way to ask. What made them broken?
The title comes from a quote from a Rhode Island officer who's describing them at the Battle of Antietam and what happened to them, where he calls them a broken regiment. They break and panic and flee the field, and his unit follows. And so it became a wonderful title to capture in a descriptive way what happened. But I also wanted readers to take away this idea that they had a story that they wanted to tell about themselves that was much more heroic than what actually happened. And so they're trying to create, a new narrative, a holistic narrative that was more conventional, and they never quite succeeded. So it becomes, even the story about themselves and the memory becomes broken. So I felt that title worked really well. It conveyed both ideas. But yeah, and that's their first battle, and they never recover from it, and they end up captured at Plymouth, and most of them are imprisoned at Andersonville. And so it's a really haunting story
Yeah.
for them. And I just, like I said, I just became intrigued and wanted to keep going and write a whole book about them.
Yeah. Now, did that idea of them breaking and then trying to control their story and not be defined by that moment. I mean, that resonates a lot with what we see now in your new book, Dread Danger, where you have two regiments that you focus on that seem to be defined by one terrible moment on the battlefield, and they spend the rest of their careers and their lives sort of reckoning with that. Was that an intentional carryover?
It was intentional in the sense that once I realized I had enough material on the 16th Connecticut and that I was going to write a whole book about them, be, when I began to explore this question of cowardice and what happened to them in Antietam, I realized this was not unusual. I was reading their firsthand accounts, their letters and their diaries right after Antietam, and they were talking about, you know, how fearful they had been. And one of them says, I'm a coward. And I had never seen anything like that in soldiers' letters. And so it made me curious, were there others? And so I was simultaneously working on that book. And then I began to, you know, compile information. It started with the Second Texas. And I thought, initially I even thought maybe I would write just a big book about cowardice, and it would be individuals and potentially units. But that struck me as really challenging, and I'm glad I didn't. And look, there's been criticism on this topic. I quote Gary Gallagher, and Katie Shively about, this idea that you can't, it's hard to define cowardice when it comes to individuals. And I understand what they're getting at. So there's also there was also a great book by Chris Walsh that's just called Cowardice. And his book came out just before my 16th Connecticut book came out. And his book is more episodic. He looks at court martial cases and accusations of cowardice. And so I also felt like that filled the niche for individuals. And as I said, I began to explore the story of the Second Texas. And then I decided, okay, I need a contrast. And I was talking to Harry Smeltzer about this. Harry's got the great Bull Runnings website, and he suggested the 11th New York. He suggested I should look at them and went in that direction. I actually had two other regiments I originally planned to include in this book. And it was taking me so long to finish it. I decided to just stick to the 2 units as a kind of balance. And then the other 2 units, one is the 126th New York, and the other is the 8th United States Colored Troops. So I had a Black unit and another Northern unit. And so I've written about them in chapters, in book chapters. So I still had, research and things I wanted to say about them. So I just decided to put them in other places.
Yeah. So I really liked the structure of Dread Danger, where you have the Second Texas, you've got the 11th New York, so you've got Eastern Theater, Western Theater, North, South. It reminded me a little bit of Ken Burns juxtaposing Elijah Hunt Rhodes with Sam Watkins, but that gives you a lot of lenses to look at the military and social and political forces that are surrounding these units as they're kind of going through their stories. You know.
Yeah, and I did not realize until I began writing that if you see what I do in the beginning of the second section on the Second Texas, that the 11th New York, and they become famous or infamous as the Fire Zouaves, that there were newspapers covering them in Texas. And that I thought was remarkable. And so it also allowed me a good segue to tell the story I wanted to tell about the Fire Zouaves, their sort of rise and fall, and then shift to, okay, meanwhile in Texas, people are reading about this regiment, and they're reading about their implosion. And they're, of course, bragging and assuming that not just Confederate soldiers, but Texas Confederate soldiers are going to be superior. So it allowed me to, what I hope that the reader gets out of it is just it shows the similarities, of course, in expectations, but also on the Southern side, there is an added element to it because, the notion of Southern honor is so crucial to a unit like the Second Texas. And yeah, there, of course, there are vast differences. As I also talk about, the Second Texas gets the chance to keep fighting, unlike the 11th New York. They pretty much, they're up Bull Run, everything goes wrong for them. They're blamed for the entire battle, and they never recover. The Second Texas keeps going after Shiloh, where they're accused of cowardice, but it hangs over them, especially their officers. And then it's sort of anticlimactic, the rest of their story. They're at Vicksburg, they're captured, exchange. Well, they pretty much don't wait for an exchange. They just go home. Yeah. And there's this remnant of them, a skeleton of the unit that survives, but it's just not the same. So I felt that, like I said, that just worked well in the telling of these 2 unit histories to have them separate, but also look for these connections.
And the way you talk about the disintegration of the Second Texas, I mean, to me, it really underscored, I think, some of the insightful, thoughtful questions you ask in this book. Because here they break at Shiloh, they have this hanging over them, they try to find redemption, they eventually get surrendered at Vicksburg. Some of them come back, they're deprived of supplies, they're starving, and there's this whole like, what was it all for? Like, we went through all this, we tried to find redemption, and what's the point? And it's in many ways a really tragic question.
It is, and that's another element of this book and really all the books, my three monographs now is of course the memory, the memory aspect, and that they will parts of their story, especially the story of William Rogers, that will become part of the lost cause, right? That he was a martyr for the lost cause. But they're not a famous unit. They're not part of Texas Hood's Brigade. They're not the Hood's Texas Brigade. They're not uh, a unit that really stands out. If you know a lot about Vicksburg, you might know, in fact, about them and their role there. But they get kind of overshadowed, I think, too. And of course, they're in the Western theater, which, and I can say this is somebody who, grew up fascinated and focused on the Eastern theater. That's another element to their story, so that the Shiloh part of it just fades away. And yet, yeah, there is some emptiness there about the meaning behind their service. And they just get wrapped up into the broader, again, celebration of the lost cause. And I thought that was really interesting to explore.
I also thought too, being Texans specifically, and Texas is probably the least impacted of the Confederate states, and their capital doesn't fall. So there's still kind of this strength that the Texans carry at the end of the war. And so for these guys to come back and have this story hanging over them and this legacy, this tarnished legacy, amidst colleagues who perhaps still feel like they've got a little something left in them. That must have been a really interesting juxtaposition for those veterans too, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't find a lot of evidence that they, got involved in veteran reunions. Sam Houston Jr., who served with them briefly, he ends up wounded at Shiloh, and then once he recovers, and he's in prison, once he recovers, he's exchanged. He goes and serves in a cavalry unit. I thought it was kind of interesting that he doesn't make a big deal about any of his Confederate service in the post-war. He really lives on his father's legacy and the sort of, again, generic lost cause ideas. But yeah, they're not like the veterans we know in other parts of whether it's in the North or even the Virginia centered phenomenon that's going to go on with Lee is the almost the cult of Lee. None of that is going to happen to them. They're not part of that. They're not going to participate in that. And it does, you're right, it underscores that this is a chapter from what happens after the war, the post-war experience, that I think is not entirely recognized when we think about Reconstruction. And Texas it's always unique, but it's going to have a different story again that evolves. And these veterans, is not to say they don't still feel part of the broader Confederate history, but I just think it's just more complicated for them.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the Second Texas. We'll talk about the 11th New York in a second. The Second Texas, not a well-known unit. For listeners who don't know their story, can you just encapsulate it real quick for them?
Yeah, they're organized in the summer and fall of 1861, and they are brought to, essentially what's happening is there are local communities that are creating companies. Some of them were former militia units, and this regiment is pieced together mainly from counties around Houston and Galveston. Their colonel, their first colonel, John Moore, is a West Pointer, and he is not from Texas, but he was stationed in Texas when the war began in Galveston. He was tasked with defending Galveston. And then when it was clear that there was enough men to create this regiment, it was supposed to be the first Texas. It sort of becomes pretty controversial that Louis Wigfall takes that name for his own unit, and so they're the second, and they never entirely get over it. But I thought like that, even that was like another, like, right? It just fits. It fits.
Yeah, right.
They're not the first; they're the second. And months go by, and they're training. Unlike the 11th New York, which didn't have a lot of opportunity for training, they are in Galveston for a while. They're learning how to be a soldier. There are a number of officers who, especially at the captain level, who want to get out because they feel like maybe they're never going to leave Texas and they want to see action and they're keen on getting to Virginia or somewhere closer to the war front. Finally, in the spring of 62, they're rushed, really in March 62, they're rushed to Corinth. And within a few days, they find themselves at the Battle of Shiloh. And the first day, they fight as well as any other Confederate unit. You know, if you know the battle, the first day is a Confederate victory, but it's not over. You know, the Union, Grant, they're reinforced. He's reinforced and he keeps fighting the second day. And for a number of reasons, things go very, very badly for the Confederates, including the loss of their general, Albert Sidney Johnson. And so what happens there, and I, you know, had pieced together accounts, the best evidence, excuse me, I came across was that they're in a situation on the second day where they and their officers, this unit, the men in the ranks, are convinced that what they're facing in front of them is the enemy. And they're being told over and over again, no, these are friendly troops. These are reinforcements. Well, the second Texas, they were right. And William Hardee, who was telling them to hold their fire, was wrong. And Hardee's going to be the source of the accusations. So when they're fired upon, they completely break. There's infiltrated fire. It's just a catastrophe for them. It doesn't mean that they don't regroup. Several of them, you know, they're this is true. I have found in reading about these kind of incidences, it's not like a complete wipeout. You're going to have officers step up and behave very courageously, including William Rogers, and he is going to gather up a counterattack. But you know, this is it's going to be a lost cause right there in that moment, and eventually they will retreat, and of course the day will be won by the Union. But John Moore, the colonel, who wasn't even with the regiment, he had been put in place to command the brigade. There's a lot of chaos happening on the battlefield, so he's not directly with them, and that adds to the confusion. He is arrested briefly for their behavior, and this is going to be a real problem for him and really the rest of his career as a Confederate officer, that somehow he did something wrong, where all the evidence I could find is that he did nothing wrong. But Hardee, and I can't entirely answer why he becomes fixated on the second Texas, because there were other units that broke, but this becomes his obsession, that they failed and the fact that they were Texans. And so he writes in more than one report back to Richmond about their behavior. And there's also these accusations make their way home to Texas. They're in the newspapers. And William Rogers, who becomes the new colonel, he had been lieutenant colonel, he becomes convinced that he has to redeem himself and his unit. And he's writing home letters to a doctor and basically asking the doctor to publish the letters anonymously to defend the unit. And this happens. It's more than one letter that's going to show up to defend them and say these accusations are completely false. So it gets pretty intense. And then we end up, the unit will end up at the Battle of Corinth in October of 62. So later that year. And on the second day of the Battle of Corinth, Rogers is he's tapped to lead a charge on Fort Robinette. And this is like a forlorn hope. It's really a suicide mission. And he knows it. And I argue that there's evidence not only that he protested the order. There's a staff officer that will later recount in a post-war publication that Rogers basically said, "Are you sure? Are you sure we're supposed to attack?" And the officer tells Rogers yes. And so Rogers says, "Okay, we're going to go." He was wearing an iron vest to protect himself, which does not fit, right, with somebody who is willing to sacrifice himself for the Confederate cause or for his men. And he also, moments before he's killed, he waves a white flag because he realizes that it's hopeless. So all these details come into play, but they're largely forgotten. And what's remembered is his bravery. And he is brave. He is literally leading his men and some men from other units. And and it's just a complete debacle. And the unit after that, they're going to have a new colonel. They're going to end up at Vicksburg. Um, they're going to they're going to be in a position known as the Second Texas Lunette, if you know the Battle of Vicksburg at all. They become known as sharpshooters. They are designated as sharpshooters. So they're a skilled, uh, right? They're a very skilled unit, but they're still struggling with leadership and with supplies and with morale. And as we were saying earlier, it just becomes anticlimactic for them. Of course, Vicksburg's going to fall, and they're going to most of them end up just going home against orders and never return. A few do return, some do return. Uh, but this is just going to be the end of their service until 1865, and they are back in Galveston in those final weeks and months of the war. And Galveston has been really a location of a great deal of suffering and inner turmoil. There have been lack of food. There's been disease running rampart. And the Second Texas both is trying to keep the peace, and there's evidence that even soldiers from this unit are part of protests, a riot that starts to break out over food supplies. And it's very, very bleak. It's not the heroic, celebrated uh, image that so many of them had going into war. And I talk about some of the poetry of the time, the rhetoric from generals and politicians about not just the Confederacy but Texans and how they're going to fight bravely. And there they are, the remnant of this unit, literally struggling to feed themselves and survive. So again, it is a very tragic, I think, ending.
Yeah, yeah. And I think of all the people that to have kind of focus on them and kind of make them his whipping boy. Old reliable, William Hardee's got a great reputation as a, military hero. And then maybe the one guy who could really stick up for him, Albert Sidney Johnston, gets killed at Shiloh, and he's got deep Texas connections. And,
Yes.
I sort of wondered as I read, like, what would have happened had Johnston lived just for those poor guys in the Second Texas.
That that's right. And like I said, I couldn't entirely explain Hardy's obsession with them. I think a few things were happening. I think he decided to make an example of them, that he wanted to ensure that the other Confederate soldiers understood that this behavior was just entirely unacceptable, and he wanted to shame them. I think also, I dug back a little bit into his own pre-war service, and he was actually accused of cowardice when he was a young officer in the Mexican-American War, where he was captured by Mexicans, and there was talk, and there was an inquiry about his behavior as a young officer. And so I don't know if that just made him hypersensitive
Mm.
to anything coming close to it. But no, it's quite something. And I also argue, and I was struck by the timing, because he writes probably his longest and most direct attack on the Second Texas, and he takes the entire regiment. That's what's also notable. He writes it at the end of October 1862. This is after Corinth. This is after Rogers is dead, and there's already been a celebration of him as a martyr. It doesn't matter to Hardee. He's still, and he even says that he had seen the unit in the summer prior, just in the summer of 62. He had seen them on the parade ground, and they had their flag with Shiloh stitched in it, which they were allowed and authorized to do. And he's furious. And he recounts that he started telling generals around him that how possibly could this unit have Shiloh as a battle honor after what he saw on the ground at Shiloh. So he's not going to let it go.
She's a little fight there going on, I suppose.
Yes, yes. No, we hear about the politics. I guess you always think about it. I think Civil War historians, the Army of the Potomac was so politicized, and certainly there's stories about Bragg. He's always in the middle of everything, but I don't know that many people look at Hardee as getting in there and having fights with his fellow officers.
So the other unit that you talk about that you focus on is the 11th New York, a more famous unit. People have probably heard of them.
Yeah.
They actually seek out fame in a lot of ways because of their connection with their commander, Elmer Ellsworth. But for folks who might not be familiar with them, can you give us a little synopsis of their adventures?
Yeah, that's right. It's good to emphasize that they are famous. They're famous before they even go to their first battle, which will be their last battle. And they're largely famous because of Elmer Ellsworth, who became a celebrity the summer prior. He had raised a company, essentially a militia company in Chicago of Zouaves, and they were based on French Algerian troops. They wore these very flamboyant uniforms. They performed sort of a gymnastic drill. They would climb on each other and do spins, and it was quite a spectacle. Uh, but he was training them. None of this was meant to be entertainment. He wanted to change people's minds. He believed that Americans didn't respect soldiers. He believed that he could help bring bourgeois respectability to these young men in Chicago, something that he sought his entire life. He came from very humble beginnings and had to work his way up and became incredibly well connected, so well connected that he was a clerk in Lincoln's office in Illinois. So this is all going to help him, of course. When the war begins, he goes with Lincoln. He's actually one of his bodyguards. He goes with Lincoln to Washington, and he wants Lincoln initially to create a new bureau, a militia bureau. So these would be the sort of citizen soldiers, not professionals, right? Not West Pointers that are going to serve the country. And Lincoln is intrigued by it and wants to help him, but he's also feeling the heat from West Pointers, frankly, who some supported Ellsworth, but many of them were suspicious of him as a kind of toy soldier and wannabe soldier. And Lincoln's working his way, he's talking to his attorney general, he's talking to the Secretary of War to see if he can find a place for Ellsworth. And then, of course, Fort Sumter falls. And Lincoln calls for 75,000 militia, ironically. And Ellsworth decides he is done waiting around. He doesn't want to be a bureaucrat in Washington. He wants to lead. And he rushes to New York City. He clearly had connections there prior. But this time, he's not going to raise a unit of just sort of everyday New Yorkers or everyday Chicagoans who served in his Chicago Zouave unit. He wants firemen. He wants New York City firemen. And what's so interesting about that is, these men, many of them are Irish immigrants. They are working class, and the question of their bravery is, they are the definition of brave. Just and they literally run into fires. So there's a real physicality to them as men and as courageous firemen. And so he decides this is perfect. He's going to take them, train them as his Zouaves with the fancy uniforms, and even he's created a drill manual that he mostly plagiarizes from Hardy and others. William Hardy wrote his own manual. And he just tells people they'll be instant soldiers, that it's not even that they're just so inherently valorous. It's going to be nothing for him to take them to the fight. And because he's so well connected with Lincoln, he's going to get to jump over some normal red tape. He has this enormous response. He has more men than he knows what to do with, and they're going to proudly march through the streets of New York City, leave in the latter part of the month of April, end up in Washington, D.C., and he's soon going to find he cannot control them. They love him, but they part of their culture is their bravado and their anti-conformity attitude, and so they're not interested in discipline and military discipline and learning maneuvers or parading around, that they really have no interest in that. And it's really getting to be a struggle. And they're also starting to commit crimes. They start to harass other soldiers, civilians. There is even accusations that they're setting fires just so they can put them out. So it's really a bit of a disaster. They're saved when there is a fire in Washington, D.C., near the famous Willard Hotel, and they're called into action, and they do their thing, right? And they put the fire out, and there's a huge image of them. There's an engraving of them that appears in Harper's Weekly, and you can see them. They look like trapeze artists climbing, like a human ladder. And so this seems to quiet down a little bit some of the concerns, but not really. They're just still incorrigible. And so this leads to talk about tragedy, shocking death of Ellsworth. They get orders to move into Alexandria, Virginia, the end of May, near the end of May, 1861. And there's a few accounts on this, and I kind of come down and saying it's a very, very impulsive act that Ellsworth takes, where he gets his men. They come down on some ships, to cross the Potomac, and before they're all off the boats and he gets them all settled in, and without any reconnaissance, he just decides to take a handful of soldiers, two reporters, his chaplain, because he's very self-aware of the press, to a boarding house where there's an enormous Confederate flag flying. And there's evidence that the fire zouaves, as they're called, the 11th New York fire zouaves, they saw it. They could see it from the other side of the river. There's even some indication that maybe from the White House that Lincoln could see it, maybe with binoculars. And Ellsworth decides he's taking that flag down. He's not going to tell his soldiers to take it down. He's taking it down. So they rush into this house. It's very early in the morning. He climbs up to the top of the roof, takes it down, and while he's coming down the steps, the owner of the boarding house kills him with a shotgun right through the chest, and he's dead. And this becomes, of course, a huge story in the newspapers, and he becomes a martyr. There are songs written about him, lithographs. Children are named after him, but his regiment is a mess. They never recover from that, even before they do see combat. And they loved him. They do not love their new commander. His name is Noah Farnham, even though he's one of them. He's a fireman. He decides that he's done with the Zouave manual and pretty much the uniform, and he's going to get them in shape. And they really resent it. And so, that kind of sets up for a catastrophe. And I will say at Bull Run, they're in a very bad situation, not entirely their own fault that the entire Union Army fails that day, but they get blamed. And some of it has to do, there's a congressional investigation, some of it has to do with the bad blood from prior, whether it's coming from these regular officers who go to testify against the unit. And I think that ties back to Ellsworth. And then just the hijinks that they had been committing before the battle. But they break. They're ordered to support, this is on Henry Hill, they're ordered to support an artillery position, and everything goes wrong for them. And the accounts from the men themselves just talk about confusion. They don't understand the orders, and they just run away. And that is the beginning of the end for the Union Army. And after that, there's attempts for them to regroup, reassemble, get new soldiers, new recruits, and it never quite takes. And so in June of 1862, they are mustered out of service. And some members will go and serve in other units, but this is pretty much the end of their story.
And it's almost because they were so famous that they set themselves up for this fall that they can't recover from, it seems to me.
Yeah, and so one of the things, talking about controlling the narrative, when we were talking earlier about 16th Connecticut, and the second Texas tried to do this, at least in the manner of their Colonel Rogers, who was writing those letters back to Houston. The 11th New York, they get all caught up in the politics of New York City, and of course, there's these very important newspapers, the Tribune, the Times, the Herald, and they are hoping and trying to gain favor in the press, and the press starts to turn on them. And there's some pretty intense fights amongst the newspapers. And there's even a story where some members of the unit come upon a few reporters, I think it was at a bar, and they beat them up because they're so angry at the editorials that have been coming out and raking them over the coals. So yeah, they want the story to be that they fought well, of course, at Bull Run, they fought bravely, but that's really going to be overshadowed again by these other accounts, especially the notion that they were terrible soldiers and completely that even before they went into battle, they could not be trusted and relied upon. There's even a quote in the congressional investigation where one of the officers says something like, he knew that they could not be relied upon, that there was just no way that he was going to trust his battery to a bunch of these firemen, that was a disaster. So it's pretty bleak for them.
Wow. Now, we've been talking, sort of the focus of our discussion has been, the story of the regiments and kind of that level of the arc. But you spend a lot of time in the book on the individual level of the soldiers as they themselves grapple with their combat experience, the experience of this narrative of cowardice, the memory stuff. What was it like to spend time with these guys as they're grappling with some pretty depressing stuff on a lot of levels?
I've always felt and it goes back to again my teen years, very connected to the common soldier, and uh, it's powerful to read their actual words, to read diaries, letters. I am a kind of historian. I don't. Some Civil War historians are either skeptical or completely reject using post-war accounts, and I don't do that. I think we use everything. I feel like you have to be skeptical and you have to use your critical eye when you're looking at something post-war. But it is true that it depends on the audience. Of any source can have biases. But yes, I think hearing from the men themselves, whether it's some of those zouaves who are talking about the moments of they recount the very moment when they're rushed into Bull Run and they realize they're under fire, or again, the accounts from Shiloh. Sam Houston Jr. wrote, I thought, a pretty memorable account of Shiloh, and it's called Shiloh's Shadows. And he has a statement in there about how, and he wrote this after the war, but I still think it's incredibly insightful. And he talks about there's a moment where they're moving about and they don't really know where they're going, and they're not sure what's in front of them. And he says that as soldiers, they lose their sense of self. And I thought that was so profound of a reflection. So yeah, it's very moving and powerful to read the words of the soldiers and try to convey that in my own writing, to try to get a sense of what it was like, because you know I've never been in combat. I don't come from a family in the military. Being here at West Point, I'm talking to young people that are preparing themselves for that kind of life, and it's hard to convey it. It's hard to understand it, even for men that have endured it, even for young men and women today who have endured it. And so I think that these voices, they're so important, and as best we can, we want to try to capture them.
The thing that really kind of clued me into, I was in for a good experience as a reader is, you start the book in the trenches with the chaplain of the 35th Mississippian, and it's not a unit you spend a lot of time with, but like here we're at this soldier level view in the trenches, in the mud. And I think you really do a nice job throughout the book of sort of capturing that soldier view of all of these experiences. I thought it was a real great strength of the book. So,
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I found that diary. I didn't know about it. It's been published. And it's really one letter that he wrote, that particular chaplain wrote over a series of days about the siege. And I was at Vicksburg doing research in their library. And I just was asking for anything. They had a few things on the Second Texas, but I wanted other units that might have been near them or in the same, brigade. on up, right? You're always, for me, I'm looking for kind of a cross section. If I can't get enough about this particular moment related to the regiment, okay, well, maybe somebody else, like that Rhode Island unit, when they talked about the officer talking about the 16th at Antietam. And his words really stay with me. I originally was going to take another statement from his letter as a title, as something like, and I use it in the introduction as a kind of section break, something like, it makes the bravest men cowards. I thought that was really profound, but then I thought that was misleading about the book, because I'm not in any way, trying to say that all of these men were cowards, but that the accusation of it had an effect and could be devastating to them uh, in the short and the long term. And so I thought him talking about fear and the experience of just waiting, and as I say, he's a non-combatant. He's not fighting, but he's describing what he's seeing around him. I thought that was really on point.
Yeah. So as we head into the home stretch here, and I don't want you to give away the ball game because I want people to read your book, which is just a wonderful experience. Um, but what did you learn as you wrote the book and you finished it up? I'm always looking when I'm doing a writing project. What am I going to learn out of this? What's something that you learned that you're really glad that you wrote this book because you learned it?
That's such a great question. Well, I learned a lot about the Western theater, these main campaigns. And I have to give credit. I've had some fantastic graduate students. I've got two right now, Trace Brusco and Bradley Smith, who read all of this, every page for me, and gave me great input and caught errors for me that I would have been embarrassed to have let go in print. I, I've I started taking my classes to Vicksburg, and then we went to Shiloh last year. So I would combine with the ROTC program at Alabama and then my own students. So I learned a lot, just factual information about these battles that I just did not possess. Because again, I grew up with Gettysburg and Antietam and
Yeah.
Fredericksburg, so that was tremendously helpful. I think I also, I talk about it in the beginning of the book, and this again carries over from the 16th Connecticut, and even from my biography of Pickett, is thinking about the creation of narratives and how, I refer to Drew Faust, and she did this, she gave this talk, NEH talk, and she's published this in other places about war narratives, and that our creation of stories about battles and war, that they often follow a certain trajectory of, having a beginning, and an end, and it's usually an end toward some kind of victory or goal. But it interests me that that's not always the case. So looking at both these units, things, they don't really end up in a good place. They do not end up in a good place for either of them, and that's so I'm fascinated by that. So I learned a lot. I tried to read a little bit too outside of history and understand some things, about literature and, again, this notion of battle stories. And I'm hoping to bring that. That's my plan for the next book on Mobile, is to reassess the battle narrative in a different way. So I feel like I've tried to do this for biographies and for unit histories, and try to think about a different way that you can describe a battle, that it's not the conventional way of two sides, and we have, right, a, a mission and a goal achieved, but maybe try to mix that up a little bit in understanding Mobile, because I think Mobile is, because people don't know a lot about it, and it is also one of those campaigns that it doesn't have it takes a while. It's a really long, involved campaign. So I would say that's also part of my learning, where my thinking's been.
Cool. So, any final thoughts you'd like to give our listeners as they approach your book? Something you want them to look for, or something you're hoping they're taking away?
Well, I do hope, and I appreciate your kind words. I hope they find it accessible. I know there's a lot of footnotes. My own father complained to me about that. I'm one of those people that it takes me a while to write books, and I spend a lot of time uh, in my notes. and maybe a little too excessively.
But
Luckily,
I like that
Cambridge,
they're footnotes because they're right there and
yeah,
you can work with them.
me too. Me too. And Cambridge let me keep not only keep them, but put them as footnotes. So I hope that doesn't. I hope that for me, I hope the historians, the scholars, that's where I'm going to go when I'm reading a book. I'm going to read the text and then go to the notes. And I hope that people maybe that are more general readers will appreciate that you don't have to look at the notes if you don't want to. You can just keep going with the stories. And yeah, I guess at the end with any book, you want people to learn something that maybe they hadn't learned, or think about, in this particular case, think about the war in a very different way, in the way we remember war, and again, what we forget, what's been left aside, that to bring some of these elements back.
Uh, so my last question, real quick one, goes all the way back to the start of our interview. Do you still do any Civil War drawing?
No,
No?
I do
Okay.
not. I do not. And I've thought maybe when I retire,
Okay.
not retiring in the near future, but maybe when I retire. And I've explained this to other people that I look at drawing the way you might a foreign language, that I can't simply pick up a pencil and a pad of paper and draw at the level that I used to draw. Because I mean, I was taking art classes. And again, I was a double major briefly, at least I think for the first 2 years of undergrad. And that was a very long time ago. So I can't do it anymore, but I'd like to get back to it. And I'm hoping it'll come back. Like again, like these other skills that we all probably can think of that we haven't had the opportunity to use. So I would love to get back into it. And I'd love, I've had people say to me maybe to do almost a graphic
Okay.
history, and that appeals to me quite a bit. I think it would be a tremendous amount of work, but maybe that'll be my next big project.
Well, best of luck with Mobile. That's a tough nut to crack right there anyway. And I'm
Yes.
sure that that'll be a great, whatever you come up with that will be great. And then happy writing or happy drawing after that. So,
Well, thank you, Chris. I
yeah,
appreciate it.
it's been a delight chatting with you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
So
I've
I'm
enjoyed
Chris
it.
Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.